Respected friends, let's start with an uncomfortable truth. Success is not hard because it's complicated. It's hard because it's slow, painfully slow, slower than most people are willing to tolerate. We live in a world trained for speed, fast results, fast money, fast recognition, but the universe doesn't work on our impatient schedule. It never has. Most people don't fail because they chose the wrong goal. They fail because they quit too early and then call it realism. They plant a seed today, dig it up tomorrow, and complain that nothing is growing. They expect years of progress to show up in weeks, and when it doesn't, they assume something is wrong with the system, with the timing, or with themselves. Here's the quiet reality no one likes to admit. The early phase of success feels exactly like failure. No applause, no validation, no visible reward, just effort going out and nothing obvious coming back. And that's where most people leave the game, not because they're incapable, but because they misread silence as rejection. But time is not your enemy. Time is the toll you pay to separate yourself from the crowd. Anyone can start, few can stay. Anyone can be excited for a month. Very few can remain disciplined for years. And the long game doesn't reward intensity, it rewards endurance. It doesn't care how motivated you feel, it only cares whether you showed up again. If you understand this, really understand it, you stop panicking when results are delayed. You stop comparing your chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 20. You stop asking, why is this taking so long? And start asking, am I still playing? Because the people who eventually win are rarely the smartest or the luckiest. They are simply the ones who stayed in the game long enough for time to work in their favor. Ladies and gentlemen, most people believe success has a price tag made of effort, intelligence, or luck. But the real currency has always been time. Not days or weeks, but years of steady commitment that feel far more expensive than any visible sacrifice. Time is the one resource that cannot be borrowed, rushed, or negotiated with, and that is precisely why it filters people so effectively. Everyone wants the outcome, but very few are willing to pay in long stretches of unseen labor. When people say success is hard, what they often mean is that it takes longer than they expected, and that delay feels unfair in a world trained to expect speed. Time exposes intentions. A goal spoken aloud costs nothing, but working on it when no one is watching begins to drain your calendar, your energy, and your patience. At first, the work feels light because hope is fresh. But as weeks turn into months and months into years, enthusiasm fades and only commitment remains. This is where the real price is paid. You wake up and do the same small actions again, not because they are exciting, but because they are necessary. Time turns repetition into a test of character, and most people quietly fail that test without realizing it. What makes time so costly is not just duration, but uncertainty. When you invest money, you often know the interest rate. When you invest time, there are no guarantees. You might work for years without clear confirmation that you are on the right path. This ambiguity creates psychological pressure. Doubt grows louder the longer results stay invisible. Friends move ahead in other directions. Comparisons creep in. The temptation to abandon the path increases, not because the work stopped being valuable, but because the weight became uncomfortable. Yet time is also what gives success its weight. Anything obtained quickly is easily dismissed or wasted. Time forces learning, correction, and humility. It removes shortcuts by making them ineffective. You cannot fake skill over a decade. You cannot pretend to be disciplined for years. Time strips away pretense and leaves only what is real. Those who remain standing are not perfect. They are simply persistent enough to let time shape them instead of fighting it. People often look at successful outcomes and assume a sudden breakthrough occurred, but breakthroughs are usually just the moment when time finishes its work. The foundation was built quietly, piece by piece, long before anyone noticed. The overnight success story is almost always a decade-long process that finally became visible. Time did not just deliver the result, it prepared the person to handle it. Without that preparation, success would collapse under its own weight. Understanding that time is the real price changes how you approach your goals. You stop asking how fast something can happen and start asking how long you are willing to stay consistent. You stop treating delays as signals to quit and start seeing them as part of the payment plan. Time is not punishing you, it is qualifying you. Those who accept this stop rushing, stop complaining, and stop looking for shortcuts because they realize that time, once paid honestly, never fails to deliver. Ladies and gentlemen, compounding rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with excitement, urgency, or visible proof. It works silently, accumulating progress in amounts too small to impress anyone in the beginning. That is why most people ignore it. They mistake quiet for weakness and slow for failure, not realizing that the most powerful forces in life operate without drama. Compounding is patient, methodical, and indifferent to human emotion. It rewards consistency, not intensity, and it punishes neglect just as reliably as it rewards discipline. In the early stages, compounding feels unfair because effort and results seem disconnected. You read, practice, save, train, or build, and nothing appears to change. The numbers barely move. The skills still feel average. The habits don't seem life-altering. This is the phase where people quit, not because progress stopped, but because it never felt important enough to continue. Compounding demands faith before it offers evidence, and most people refuse that arrangement. They want proof first, commitment later, but compounding only works in the opposite order. What makes compounding ruthless is that it does not pause for doubt or excuses. Miss a day and the loss seems insignificant. Miss a week and it still feels recoverable. Miss a year and the gap becomes brutal. Compounding magnifies both action and inaction. Small positive behaviors, repeated daily, eventually create an advantage so large it looks like talent or luck from the outside. Small negative behaviors, repeated with the same consistency, quietly accumulate into regret. Compounding does not judge, it simply multiplies whatever you feed it. Time plays a critical role here, but not in a linear way. Progress does not grow in straight lines. It bends upward, often suddenly, after long periods of stagnation. This creates a psychological trap. People assume nothing is happening because nothing is visible. In reality, the most important work is happening below the surface, where skills are sharpening, judgment is improving, and habits are stabilizing. When the curve finally turns, it feels like magic, but it is only math finishing its job. The danger of compounding is that it makes outcomes irreversible. Those who stay consistent for years pull so far ahead that catching up becomes nearly impossible. This is not because they are superior, but because they started earlier and stayed longer. Compounding creates separation. It quietly widens the gap between those who show up daily and those who rely on occasional bursts of effort. By the time the difference is obvious, it is usually too late to close it quickly. The cruelty of compounding is also its fairness. Everyone is offered the same mechanism, but very few are willing to endure its boredom. It requires doing unimpressive work for an uncomfortably long time with no guarantee of recognition. But for those who understand it, compounding becomes a source of calm. You stop chasing dramatic changes and start trusting small, repeatable actions. You stop measuring progress daily and start measuring it over years. Once you see how quiet consistency turns into overwhelming advantage, impatience loses its grip, and the long path begins to feel like the safest one. Ladies and gentlemen, failure is often loud and obvious. It shows up as a missed target, a wrong decision, or an outcome that clearly didn't work. Impatience, on the other hand, operates quietly. It disguises itself as logic, self-respect, or realism. It whispers that the effort is taking too long, that the returns are too small, that a change of direction is sensible. And because it sounds reasonable, people obey it without realizing they are abandoning something that was still alive. Far more dreams end this way than through dramatic collapse. Impatience shortens the time horizon until almost nothing meaningful can survive inside it. Great things require seasons of obscurity, repetition, and refinement, yet impatience demands immediate feedback. When feedback doesn't arrive, doubt takes over. People begin to question the goal, the process, and eventually themselves. The work hasn't failed, but the waiting has become uncomfortable. So they exit early, not because they reach the end, but because they grew tired of not knowing when the end would appear. What makes impatience so destructive is that it often strikes right before progress accelerates. Most worthwhile pursuits follow a delayed curve. Early effort builds capacity, not results. Skills are forming, systems are strengthening, and errors are being corrected, but none of this is visible from the outside. Impatience interprets this hidden phase as wasted time. People walk away just as the foundation becomes strong enough to support real momentum. From the outside, it looks like bad luck. From the inside, it was a failure of endurance. Failure, when it happens, usually teaches something clear. A bad decision reveals a better one. A wrong approach points to a correction. But impatience teaches nothing because it avoids the lesson altogether. It ends the experiment too early. The person never discovers whether persistence would have worked, so the same cycle repeats with a new goal. This creates a pattern of constant starting and stopping, which feels like activity but produces no depth. Over time, this erodes confidence because the mind learns that quitting is always an option. Impatience also distorts judgment. It pushes people toward shortcuts, premature scaling, and comparisons that poison focus. Instead of improving the process, they chase faster outcomes. Instead of strengthening fundamentals, they look for hacks. These moves feel productive in the moment, but they weaken long-term position. The irony is that impatience is often justified by the fear of wasting time, yet it is impatience itself that wastes the most time by preventing anything from compounding. Those who eventually succeed are not immune to impatience. They simply learn to ignore it. They understand that discomfort does not signal danger, and slowness does not mean stagnation. They accept that uncertainty is part of the cost and that clarity often arrives late. By extending their time horizon, they give effort room to mature. Dreams rarely die because they are impossible. They die because impatience convinces people to stop believing before reality has a chance to respond. Ladies and gentlemen, human nature is drawn to excitement. We admire dramatic breakthroughs, heroic effort, and sudden transformations because they make good stories. But real progress rarely follows a cinematic path. It is built through actions so ordinary they barely register as effort. Boring, repetitive work lacks glamour, yet it quietly produces results that moments of brilliance cannot sustain. The uncomfortable truth is that consistency, not creativity, carries most people across the finish line. Brilliant bursts feel powerful because they deliver immediate emotional reward. A surge of motivation can produce a long night of work, an ambitious plan, or a dramatic change of direction. In the moment, it feels like momentum, but bursts fade as quickly as they arrive. Energy spikes collapse, routines dissolve, and the gap between intention and behavior widens again. Without repetition, even the best ideas decay. Effort that cannot be repeated might be impressive, but it is structurally weak. Boring effort, by contrast, is built to last. It does not depend on mood, inspiration, or external validation. It relies on simple actions performed at roughly the same time, in roughly the same way, day after day. This kind of work trains the nervous system to act without negotiation. Decisions disappear, resistance shrinks, and progress becomes automatic. Over time, these small acts stack into skill, reliability, and trust, both in yourself and from others. Repetition also creates feedback loops that bursts cannot. When you do something regularly, you notice subtle improvements and small mistakes. You adjust without drama. You refine instead of restarting. This gradual sharpening is invisible in the short term, but overwhelming in the long term. Brilliant bursts often skip this phase because they aim for impact rather than mastery. They prioritize speed over accuracy and novelty over depth, which limits how far they can go. Another advantage of boring effort is that it lowers the cost of failure. When actions are small and frequent, mistakes are manageable. You can recover quickly because nothing catastrophic is at stake. Bursts, on the other hand, concentrate risk. When a massive push fails, it hurts more, discourages more, and often leads to long periods of inactivity. Boring effort keeps you in motion even when conditions are imperfect, which is most of the time. The world often mislabels this kind of persistence as mediocrity because it looks unimpressive up close. But results change that perception over time. What once looked average becomes exceptional simply because it was sustained. People eventually notice not the daily actions, but the accumulated outcome. The irony is that by the time success becomes visible, the work no longer feels boring to observers. They see only the highlight, not the thousands of quiet repetitions that made it inevitable. Those who understand this stop waiting for motivation and stop overvaluing inspiration. They design their lives around repeatable effort, knowing that boredom is not an obstacle, but a signal that the system is working. They trade short-lived excitement for long-term reliability, trusting that steady pressure applied patiently will outlast any moment of brilliance. Ladies and gentlemen, winning in the long run requires a rare balance that most people never develop. It is not just the ability to delay gratification, but the ability to do so without becoming bitter, doubtful, or disengaged. Many people can postpone rewards for a short time, but as the weight stretches on, faith erodes. Effort begins to feel foolish. Discipline turns heavy. The work continues, but belief quietly leaks away. Those who ultimately win learn how to wait without losing conviction. Delayed gratification is often misunderstood as deprivation. People imagine it as a life of constant denial, grinding through misery while hoping for a distant payoff. But that framing makes endurance nearly impossible. The winners approach it differently. They understand that gratification does not have to come from outcomes alone. It can come from progress, from competence, from keeping promises to themselves. By shifting where satisfaction comes from, they remove pressure from the final result and make the waiting sustainable. Faith plays a critical role during long stretches of uncertainty. When external evidence is scarce, internal belief must carry the weight. This belief is not blind optimism or positive thinking. It is a rational confidence built from showing up consistently and seeing small improvements accumulate. Each completed day reinforces the idea that the process works, even if the results remain invisible. Over time, this creates emotional stability. Setbacks no longer feel like verdicts, and delays no longer feel like rejection. What breaks most people is not the absence of reward, but the fear that the reward may never arrive. This fear turns patience into anxiety. People begin to scan for signs, demand reassurance, and compare themselves to others who appear to be ahead. These behaviors drain energy and distort judgment. Those who win learn to limit this noise. They narrow their focus to what they can control today and trust that time, when combined with correct action, is rarely wasted. Delaying gratification also protects against premature decisions. When people crave immediate payoff, they often settle for smaller wins that block larger ones. They choose comfort over growth, certainty over potential, and speed over quality. Winners resist this impulse. They are willing to look wrong for longer, stay quiet while others talk, and build while others chase visibility. This restraint compounds into leverage. When the moment finally arrives, they are prepared to move decisively because they were never distracted by short-term rewards. Faith, when preserved through long delays, becomes a competitive advantage. It keeps effort clean and focused. It prevents emotional exhaustion and reduces the urge to constantly change direction. The ability to wait calmly, work steadily, and trust the process is not glamorous, but it is rare. And rarity, when paired with time, produces disproportionate results. Those who master delayed gratification without losing faith do not just reach success. They arrive with the stability to keep it.